Chapter 21. I had rarely seen Nick at a loss for words, but he was now. He gaped at us, then at the door through which Julian had been carried. "A girl?" he said finally, as though unsure of the meaning of the word. "That's impossible." Certainly, it seemed impossible that such a fact could have escaped our notice all this time. But of course, looking backward, I could see a dozen clues that, had I bothered to add them together, would have led me to that very conclusion. "Impossible or not," Sander said, "I'm afraid it's true." Nick's astonishment gave way to anger. "It can't be true. You can't tell me I've been fencing with a girl for most of a year and never knew it." "I won't tell you then, but it's so all the same." Nick stalked back and forth, scowling and slicing the air with his blade, as though to fend off the truth that was attempting to seize him. At last he cried, "God's blood, a girl!" and flinging the sword aside, stormed out of the room. Sander crooked his tongue in sympathy. It's a hard morsel for him to swallow, but even harder for Julian. They'll never let him go on performing. "Her," I reminded him. "Yes," he said, "her." Mr. Phillip's wife was sent for to bandage the wound, which was not so grave, aside from the damage it had done to Julian's pride and to her future as a player. Julia, I should now call her, for that was her given name. Mistress Phillips tried to coax Julia to come home with her, but Julia refused. I have never yet missed a performance, and I do not intend to miss this one. After much discussion, the sharers concluded that it was better to let a girl play the part than to assign it to a apprentice who would have to read the lines from a side. Besides, it began to look as though one of us might be needed to take Nick's place. He had left the theatre and not returned, and there was little more than an hour before performance. "We could go seek him out," Sanders suggested to Mr. Hemmings. "No doubt we'll find him in his usual haunts." "Meaning an alehouse," Mr. Hemmings said sourly. "Perhaps you'd best do that. Just be sure that the two of you are back in time, else I'll be out there myself, clean-shaven and speaking falsetto." Despite the circumstances, we could not help laughing at the picture that conjured up. "You may well laugh," Mr. Hemmings said, "but I served my time in skirts, and by all accounts I was quite fetching. More so than Nick, certainly. But though Nick may not be fetching, still he must be fetched. And though I be not comely, yet I must come," I added, drawing an appreciative laugh from the others. "Very good, Widge," said Mr. Hemmings. "You've the wit of a true player." As Sandra and I walked towards the river, I said, "Do you think I could actually be a player?" He gave me a puzzled look. "You say that as though the idea had just struck you. Isn't that what you came here for?" "Oh, aye, of course it is." Once again, I was sorely tempted to tell him the truth. I was weary of carrying the baggage of that secret about with me, always having to be careful not to let it slip. I tried to imagine how Julia must have felt, guarding her secret for years, wanting so badly to belong to the company of players that she would risk such a desperate device. And yet, because of that very device, never being able to truly belong. We were, as she had said, birds of a feather, for I had never belonged anywhere either. Now there was a chance that I might, and I could not bring myself to endanger that chance by revealing my original purpose here, even though I had abandoned that purpose, and to all appearances, so had Falconer. The south bank of the Thames was like a poor reflection of the north bank, a sort of lesser London. Across the river, the great houses of great gentlemen lined the embankment. Here on the lower ground, the buildings were nearly as imposing in size, but housed a separate family behind each of their many grimy windows. Scattered among these tenements were smaller dwellings that had given over their ground floors to some business, usually a tavern. How in heaven's name will we ken which one Nick is in? Any which looks prosperous or reputable, Sander said. We can surely pass by. We found him in a place with a sagging roof and the customary ivy growing up the front wall. Nick sat at one of these stain-scarred tables in the company of two fellows I took to be university students, a species we all knew well, as they had more money and leisure for playgoing than the working class. Sandra and I stood just inside the door and tried to attract Nick's attention, but he was too absorbed in his ale, or had absorbed too much of it to notice. Finally, we approached his table. Nick, Sander said. Nick glanced up. What are you doing here? They don't serve boys? Oh, they serve them occasionally, one of the students put in. Well roasted, with an apple in their mouth. Nick laughed harder than the jest deserved. Sander said, They're wanting you back at the Globe. It's nearly performance time. I don't need you to tell me that. I'll be along when it suits me. I thought you'd want to know, too, that Julian isn't badly hurt. What's this? The student said eagerly. You've been duelling? A trifle, Nick said with a pale smile, then turned on us. Out of here with you now, before I give the same to you, and worse. Sander backed away. I just thought perhaps you were, reluctant to come back and face her. I could tell as soon as the final word left his mouth that he would have liked to call it back. But the student had already seized upon it. Her? He echoed, laughing. Don't tell me you've taken to fighting women, Nick. Nick clapped his mug on the table so fiercely that it cracked the earthenware. I take that as an insult. Take it however you like, the student said casually. It was offered as a jest, nothing more. He gave his companion a sidelong glance of amusement. Unless, of course, it's true. Nick got unsteadily to his feet and reached across to tap the student on the front of his embroidered doublet. Be careful what you say, or I'll show you that steel is true. Quite a boast for a man without a sword, the student said. Swords are easily come by, as are university asses. The student leaped up to face him, knocking his chair to the floor. Your jest has the bitter taste of an insult. Here now, the tavern keeper called. No quarrelling inside. Take your dispute into the street. Sander snatched at Nick's sleeve. Let's go, Nick, before it comes to blows. Nick pushed him away. I've no fear of blows. They're braver than words. But I could see how his hand trembled. No more do I fear them, the student replied, though his face has gone white as Hamlet's ghost. I'll give you cause to, then. Nick raised a hand as if to strike the other. The student's hand went to the hilt of his rapier. I am no woman, to be silenced with a slap. This was more than Nick's pride could bear. He lunged across the table, seized the weapon of the second student, and yanked it free of its hanger. Enough of words! The student sprang away from the table and drew his sword as well. The tavern keeper shouted a curse, and Sander called out, No! But both protests were lost in the sudden clash of steel upon steel. It was obvious at once that Nick was overmatched, and I believe he recognized it. The look on his face was that of a man who had stepped into a stream and found that the water is over his head. He beat away the student's first two blows, but the third stung his leg and made him shuffle backward. The student followed step for step, like his partner in a deadly dance. All the techniques Nick had learned at Mr. Armin's hands seemed to desert him. He hardly tried to strike an offensive blow. It was all he could do to ward off those of his opponent. In desperation, he drew his dagger and held it before him as an added defense. The student did the same. As much as I disliked Nick, I felt something like sympathy for him. Though he was no friend, yet he was a fellow prentice, and I had no desire to see him run through. "What will we do?" I asked Sander above the din. He shook his head despondently. "There's nothing we can do. It's a matter of honor." "Honor? I'll be spitted like a pigeon and we don't help him. Where's the honor in that? It's his fight, not ours. Then I'll make it ours." I hoisted a three-legged stool, meaning to launch it at Nick's opponent. Before I could, the student moved in and feinted an edge blow at Nick's legs. When Nick lowered his dagger toward it, the student delivered a quick stoccata to Nick's throat. Nick gave a strangled cry and staggered backward. Both his weapons fell from his grasp as he clutched at the wound. He collided with a bench and toppled to the floor. "The devil take you!" I shouted at the student. "You've killed him!"